And now welcome to this panel then, looking at the future of cross-border linkages, issuance, connectivity and interoperability. I have a great panel with me to do that. So on the far right you have André from, I think, traveled the furthest maybe amongst us all, from the Republic of South Africa, CEO of the CSD there. Warmly welcome up here. Global view on interoperability, in other words, also under potentially different conditions than the one we usually talk about here in the EU. And then Alex, well known, I think, Executive Director EMEA of JP Morgan, Head of Custody, involved in a lot of things, I think, regulatory, etc., on the FMI Post-trade Board and the OMISECO. And next to him, my colleague Jean Lambert from Euroclear on the product side, also involved in OMISECO work on ISO 20022, not least, but also the ECSDA work on ISO 20022. And then Cassie as well, well known, I think, here from Deutsche Börse Clearstream. Warmly welcome, on the heads the target service governance and is involved as well in CSG and OMISECO. Lots of experience from SCORE, T+1 and whatnot, right, ISO. And then of course Juliette as well, well known in the industry from SWIFT, heading standards there, very familiar with ISO 22, the difficulties with rolling out standards globally as well as locally, not only in securities market. So warmly welcome, and my name is Roger Storm. I'm the moderator of this excellent panel here today. And the theme indeed is future of cross-border connectivity and interoperability. And I think this is a topic tied to this much larger discussion on cross-border investment, cross-border financing, how do we reach that, and hopefully in a more positive globalized world at some point in time. But the story continues. I think there are some really interesting things underway, and let's see if we can dig into that. But given the shortage of time we have, we decided to focus first on the general and then hone in on one particular point, which will be the ISO connectivity and sort of the technical standards a bit more. But I'll start off with a general question to each of you, the broad question. What are the general pain points, would you say, for cross-border financing and connectivity these days, given this backdrop of geopolitical risks? We have the regulatory demands, security demands, whatnot. We'll start with you, André.
Thank you very much, and also thank you for the invite to be here. You know, I'll probably start from, you know, the pain point from a South African perspective is probably, to a large extent, you know, let's call it government policy, right? That's caused pretty much a position where we had to start to operate from a grey listing perspective. There was state capture for a couple of years. So from our perspective, you know, in order for us to access the global markets, right, traditionally that was done either through a global custodian relationship or directly through foreign platforms. You know, with us being on a grey list, and that happening during a time when we applied for a CSD to CSD link with Euroclear, that was actually quite an extensive process for us to go through the enhanced due diligence. But our Euroclear partners have been fantastic, and by the way, we've got a great relationship with Clearstream as well. I have to say that we got a white label collateral platform in South Africa that we use through them. But you know, once that account was opened, the ability for South Africa to access global securities, actually accessing 61 markets through Euroclear, was virtually instantaneous. Right, so just to give you an idea, we did our first live trades on removals Friday last week. It took us 4 minutes between London and South Africa to settle the removal trade, right? And that for us, we've talked about, you know, straight through processing, and the Euroclear partners have been fantastic in that. So, you know, for us, accessing global markets is a really important process to go through. Most of South Africa's trades actually still with the West. Right, in South Africa, even though we've got foreign exchange controls, we've got 4.5 trillion of South African assets overseas, and essentially custodied by global custodians, right? So certainly from a South African perspective, our local capital markets wants to provide the infrastructure for those local market activity to access those foreign assets. And I think through the Euroclear link, we are going to change that world slowly but surely to be able to custody those foreign assets directly not directly in South Africa, but through Euroclear. Right, so, global interoperability for us as a country is extremely important, right? And we want to make sure that we get off that grey list as quickly as we can. And there's a lot of effort into that. And maybe just on Alexi's point, necessity is the mother of invention, right? Which, all the things that he actually talks about, the ability to actually look after the private markets, right? E-voting platform, all these sort of things are also things that we are now starting to implement fully into our market. And the necessity there is actually the ability to see who owns what asset, right? And being able to address all the FATF issues. So anyway, global connectivity is really important to us, and we're thankful for our global partners that allows us to still access that market very effectively and efficiently.
That was a very positive story, so thank you for that. Brightening.
Sorry, I didn't want to start with a negative.
So, Alex.
JP Morgan is as everybody knows, is a reasonably sized bank. We provide services to mostly in the custody business, professional and institutional clients all over the world who want to invest all over the world. So we cover about 100 plus markets. And that gives us also the privilege and the task of providing connectivity. You can call it interoperability, connectivity. In the end, it's the same thing, making sure that investors can access the markets, tap into the issuers, and get a return on their investments no matter where they go. And from that position as well, when we look at it from a global custodian perspective, Europe is obviously a huge economical area. But when you talk about Europe, you're not talking about Europe in terms of, and I'm now talking mostly from a post-trade perspective, as a single market. And that's why we got the Capital Markets Union, which is a name, but the reality is that there's no Capital Markets Union there. When investors come into Europe and they want to buy and sell securities, whether that's bonds or equities or warrants or whatever it is, or funds, they still have to go into each and every local jurisdiction, play by the local rules, fill in the required tax forms, do the onboarding and the accounting, opening, and all these kind of things, which in isolation are probably not big things. And providers like ourselves and other ones do their best to provide a seamless service, but they add up to, I would say, quite a lot of frictions. And we're in the business of large-scale investments at minimal spreads and at minimal returns. So every friction, every cost element, every inefficiency costs money. And that comes at the expense of what the investors are looking for, which is an adequate return on investment. For all intents and purposes, Europe is a pretty stable and safe place to be. Knock on wood, that it's going to be forever like that. But it's not alone in the world. Okay, there are other jurisdictions and other markets which are vying for investment as well. In the post-trade space, I think we got a limited role to play. But one of the roles which we have to play is that we make access to investment, cross-border investment, as easy as possible. And that's not just, like I said, the account opening and the onboarding process, it's also the settlement. And even, what is it now, 18 years after the launch of T2S, no, 8 years, it's still not completely smooth. And then you go into asset servicing, tax, corporate actions, general meetings, all these kind of things, and you see small, but add them all together, significant differences in all of these markets. And to end on a positive note, like my colleague here, I think it's in our collective interest to actually make those differences smaller and eventually make them disappear. So as time goes forward, and that's not going to be tomorrow, when investors come into Europe, they look at Europe as one single market. And I think we got a role to play in that.
So thank you, and maybe we can come back to that. Maybe there's differences between the asset classes. We talked about Eurobonds, I think, previously in your case, and you were mentioning that there's differences depending on the asset class. Equities might be the most challenging, and let's come back to that. Jean-Paul.
Yeah, so thank you, and thanks to the ECSDA for this invitation. I think it's a very interesting discussion. In my view, the main challenges I see in the cross-border connectivity and interoperability is actually making the link between international investors who are really looking at something standardized so that they can connect with many markets on one side, those internal investors, and on the other side, the domestic market practices and domestic markets, which have their own habits, their own way of working, own constraints like regulatory constraints, legal constraints, technical constraints. So it's, I think, a challenge to make the link between this highly standardized world on the international side and the highly customized domestic processes. I see also another challenge in connectivity is also to have an interface compatible with the different profiles of users. So if I take the example of a domestic CSD, you have to offer screen-based interface or even file-based interface to communicate with issuer paying agent, for instance, which is still a part of the process mainly based on this kind of technology. But on the other side, the same CSD has to offer highly automated processing to process the millions of instructions we receive from international or even local players. So this is another dimension to take into account the different profile of actor. And finally, I think we shouldn't put aside as well the new technology that are coming now. I think one of the challenges that we will have to answer in the coming year is to define a way to connect our traditional core CSD services with more modern services and new technologies like service supported by DLT, by AI, or by data-driven services that are usually more familiar to technologies like API, and they will probably have to coexist with well-known ISO messages that are really efficient in our core domain, so we'll have to find the way to make those two worlds coexisting together. So 3-dimension, the international versus domestic market practice, the different kind of actors, and also the different kind of technology. I think for me the main challenges we have to tackle in that domain.
And Cassie, yeah, what are your takes on the main pain points and obstacles for realizing?
I would say if we look, and I will try not to repeat many of the things that we've already heard, but I think the three flavors around where do the challenges lie that prevent Europe being as attractive a marketplace as it should be. We heard this morning about the policy aspect, the policy making aspect, and I think if I can respond to Mr. Merlin's point about do we really want to invest time in harmonizing securities law or looking at taxation law, my response as an FMI would be absolutely. Because the consequence, the opportunity cost of not doing that is that every infrastructure and every market participant needs to replicate or develop slightly different flavors to deal with that fragmentation of legislation. So that's where I would certainly see that there is more than enough for the new Commission to be getting on with. At an FMI level, I would say that, yes, there's been a lot of progress made in cross-border technologies or functionalities, but still, I believe that we have a mindset, or there is a mindset, that cross-border is an afterthought, and that is the wrong mindset. We need to really look at, and here I pick up with apologies then on several ideas that were already expressed this morning. You know, we need to look at Europe as the domestic market. And we still have today, whether it be in T2S or in the upcoming ECMS releases, we have too many aspects where cross-border aspects are more difficult than a so-called domestic market. So we need to make sure that we're tackling those, and also when we're developing new products or new pieces of infrastructure is to avoid falling into that mistake again of making cross-border or cross-CSD an afterthought. One of the consequences of that is that from a market participant perspective, we still see 9 years after the introduction of T2S, is that there are many market participants who haven't yet adapted their processes or their technologies, their platforms, to really embrace a cross CSD or a cross-border functionality. In some ways, that's not surprising, because if the infrastructures aren't in place, why would they spend investment euros or dollars in making those changes before the infrastructures are in place? So there is a slight, let's say, chicken and egg situation there, but we do know that the first and the last mile is really, really important. So I come back to Jesus's point this morning. Yes, we have a highway in T2S, but the exit and the entry ramps are really bumpy. And we know, I think also to the point that Alex made earlier, the importance of STP. We need to have front-to-back STP. There's no point in having STP on 98%, because the remaining 2% can be sufficient to have a real disincentive for large-scale investments.
That was a good many points. And the partnership with the industry, but also then politicians quite clearly need to do something on the regulatory side, and not making cross-border an afterthought. That's an interesting thought. Maybe not even post-trade an afterthought. Juliette, your thoughts on...
So at SWIFT, of course, cross-border is not an afterthought. It's what we do. It's our bread and butter. But I agree with Alex and with Kathy. I think with my standards hat on, the thing I think we should be working on is better harmonized cross-border market practice. And to do that, we need to look at the underlying regulation. So I won't harp on about that because you've already covered it. I'll take a different perspective. Maybe talk about networks and the fact that there is a trend in the market actually to diversify networks for many reasons, including my predecessor who was speaking about in times of war, you want to be sure you have backup solutions, etc. But when you're looking at networks or when you're running a market infrastructure, one of the most important things you need to understand is that your weakest link is what's going to, in the end, make you fail. So everything to do with KYC and onboarding, I think as an industry, we could do a lot more to harmonize and standardize process, because today it's still very, very difficult. And I was actually lucky enough to be part of an ISA working group looking at this problem. And there's actually a paper being published on this, which I think is worth reading. And I think if we were going to invest time as an industry, Alex is laughing. I think it's probably somewhere where it would warrant a little bit of extra effort. So that's short-termish, and I think longer term. No one's mentioned it yet in this conference, but I do think we need to think about the advent of computing and the problem we're going to have with quantum computing being able to break existing algorithms that we all use. All of the networks that we use, the infrastructures that we use today are based on existing algorithm processes. If computing can break those codes, what are we going to do? How are we going to get ready? And at SWIFT, obviously, we've been thinking about this since 2006. We've come up with a short-term solution, which is we know that it's going to be very hard to get the industry to move to this new way of working. But again, I think collectively, there's something that we could be doing there to think about how we're going to move to this new world. A bit further out, but I think we need to be doing some collective thinking.
That's a great segue over to our next set of questions, really. And please prepare your mobile phones, because we'll be soon asking you a couple of questions up here. There will be a Slido QR code for you. So honing in on that, the interoperability question, the technical, slightly more technical, the standards around connectivity, both the security ones, but also more specifically the lingua franca, then ISO 22222. How important is it that we focus on that? And what are the obstacles? And I'll start over there again with you, Andre, if you allow me.
Yeah, maybe just a perspective. So, I mean, in Africa, we've got significant interoperability issues, right, between different countries, right? So we within our area, what we call the SADC, which is Namibia, Botswana, essentially the countries around South Africa, There's multiple capabilities that you need to put in place to make sure that you get the interoperability right, which is connectivity. And, SWIFT is expensive for South Africa and for Africa. So we've built an alternative network on ISO standards that give clients choice, right? And they can use either SWIFT or they go through that platform. And literally half of the messages that operate within our environment comes through our alternative network, right, or our private network. So that's one way that we created interoperability, because, providing cheaper access to essentially do the same thing is a good way to do it. But certainly, from our perspective, ISO 20022, right, we've adopted a sort of business plan approach to different standards, right? So on the payment side, everybody is now converted in South Africa, but on the security side, it's predominantly where it adds value. Corporate actions, our e-voting platform is fully integrated into 220 standard. So that's how we thought about the world, right? So we will adopt those standards, once there's a greater community that demands the value of the standard, right? And we can fairly easily do that because, straight sort of integration services are the hub that connects our ecosystem, right? So therefore, if we adopt the standard, then everybody has to adopt it. But our approach has certainly been to have the conversation around what is the value add. But in Africa, there's, you talk about JP Morgan, and, we've got a couple of global custodians within the African market, and they always ask us the same question. How do we leverage the sort of straight ecosystem environment into the rest of Africa? Right. So certainly from my perspective, the lessons learned here this morning about, what drives interoperability truly between, and for Africa, it's even more complicated because of the national interest to keep the CSD within the local environment, right? So, but I guess it's the same for Europe as well, right? That's why you've got 22 or 28 CSDs. So I think this problem is a global problem, right? Once you go across a continent and you want to create interconnectivity, right, the problems are the same, right? In terms of regulation, law, just the cost of doing that.
Alex, what's your take?
You can talk about interoperability for hours and maybe define it in a bit more granular detail, but specifically focus on messaging standards and the syntax. And the reason, by the way, why I was laughing is because Juliette beat me to the punch in mentioning ISA, so I lost my beer from Colin. Hopefully I'll be able to recover it at some point anyway. I do my best. But what we've been in that working group, which Juliette mentioned, been looking at what's the real problem we're trying to solve here. Is it a syntax problem? Is it actually the instructions? Because that's what it boils down to. Can't the instruction not flow STP because we just are using different messaging standards? Or is the underlying problem different? To give an example, I was talking about it during the lunch break with somebody on the meeting announcements. Well, actually, most of the problems on the meeting announcements are not the result of a syntax. They're the result of essentially rigid requirements on how to fill in certain message fields. And unless you play back exactly in the way which the issuer the registrar is asked to provide that information, unless you play it back to them in exactly the same way, the instruction falls out of step, which then leads to operational risk, it leads to delays, it leads to additional costs and all that kind of stuff. So in short, we need to be really careful about which problems are caused by a messaging standard problem versus which problems have got underlying more fundamental issues which need to be addressed, and try to address those rather than have a headline, which with all respect for T+1, we saw it in the US as well, we see it now in Europe. It's an easy thing to say. You can say it in one sentence. And often the reaction, I think, of especially people who are not close to this environment is to focus on things you can just express in one sentence and everybody says, ah, yeah, that's what it is. Whereas most of the problems we're dealing with in our day-to-day jobs, and I think everybody around the room is facing to a larger or smaller extent with that one, it's not the headlines, it's the smaller, more complex stuff which we need to attack. And that's why no matter which project of interoperability or standardization or whatever we embark upon, we need to first identify what the problem is and what the right solution or the cure is to solve that problem.
Jean-Paul.
Yeah. I agree that sorry, the most important point in terms of standardization is probably not the exact technical message we use. And I think when we talk about standards and about ISO 20 or 22 in particular, I like to make the distinction between the data standards, so the way the data are organized, the data dictionary, the way the data is defined, and the message itself. And I think the data have much more value than the messaging format, because the data can be used, the data repository can be reused in any kind of communication, which can be ISO messages, but also screens or reports or whatever type of technology. I think the important thing is to make sure that there is no loss in translation, no ambiguity in the way the information is exchanged, and there the data is really important. And then the message come on top to have a more consistent technological approach in the way messages are exchanged. But I think when we implement a new standards, and I think a new data standards or even message standards, we don't have to forget it's a quite intensive work. I think the messaging are only the visible part of the iceberg, because usually if you implement a new data standard, you have a quite big impact in your internal system, in your internal process, which can somehow require full modernization of your internal processes, just because you have to expose new kind of data or different ways to structure the information. So this is something we have observed quite recently in the implementation of the general meetings, where we have improved the data structure, but we all had quite big project to support that with SRD2. It was not far from being a walk in the park. And I think the ongoing CBBR Plus migration is also a good example of how hard it is to migrate to a new data standard. So it's something that we should not neglect when we consider implementing a messaging standard. And then when new messages are implemented, then you start having a coexistence period, and some actors will have to play with two different sets of messages, maintaining them in parallel, and there some incentives appear to fully migrate to a new standard to just avoid maintaining both in parallel forever. That's one of the reasons why the ECSDA has issued last year a recommendation to gradually phase out first implement 20 or 22 message with the launch of ECMS, and then start getting a view on the future stage where we would only support 20 or 22 for corporate action, and gradually phase out 15 or 22 message so that everyone can use the same message with the CSDs. But there is still some work, obviously, to be done in that direction, obviously. Thank you.
Kathy, and we're getting some of the interesting results there already through the poll. Thank you for answering.
It's difficult for me to see here because of the light, but I'm going to keep this very short because the colleagues to the left and right of me are so much more expert than me on this topic. I would say, as a practitioner, we should only go for these standards where we know that they deliver real value. There has to be a real solid business case for going through a transition. One aspect, I'll pick up one aspect then from some of the previous comments. I think it's very important that when we have a discussion about ISO 20022 or protocols, whatever, we're thinking about it as being interface agnostic. Because we don't want to, we need to bring that level of differentiation into the discussion, which would bring me to the second point, which is the importance of good quality data. And that, I think, is where some of the discussions that are ongoing at the moment can actually bring more value than focusing purely on one type of messaging, but instead to say, what do we need to do to make sure that we have a high quality of consistent information going in at the top of the chain? Because many, and I think this plays to the point that Alex raised, many of the problems, if we're looking at the problem statement, actually lie elsewhere.
Thank you. Juliette, this is really your home turf.
The impossible task of commenting on the results of this survey, which so it's interesting, I think, to see that 40% of the people who answered the question think that we should have a wholesale but stepwise migration per domain. So that would, to me, mean that we would globally agree on certain business domains and then set dates for the world to migrate to ISO 20022 messaging. And while I think that it's desirable to move to ISO 20022, I'm not sure the word messaging I agree with Jean-Paul. I think we should get away from talking about messages and talk about the underlying data model in the repository, and wholesale migration to using the ISO 2082 data model and repository, I think makes sense. But then whether you send a message or an API or whether you use a GUI or whatever it might be, as long as the data that you're sending is commonly understood by everyone, I think that's where you get the biggest bite for your buck. If you, for example, I don't think forcing someone to move from one message standard to another is going to be where we get the best value. The 33%, a third of the people in the room seem to think that we should do Big Bang, global Big Bang. That makes me shudder because it would be so complicated to be able to do that. And I'm looking at the payments migration now at Swift, which is relatively simple compared to doing that. I mean, we've been talking about that for more than 10 years. We've set dates, and Swift has the ability, I think, to set dates in the cross-border payment space because a lot of that traffic does go over our network. But forcing a wholesale Big Bang migration for all business areas, I don't know who would be able to enforce it. And it would certainly, to your point, Kathy, need a very strong business case and a lot of buy-in from the industry to do that. So my personal view would be no mandated migration. I think people should move when there is a business case, when there is a business opportunity. And most importantly, I think people should spend time on the ISO 2082 data dictionary and repository because it's an open standard. It's only as good as the people that have been building it, which involve a lot of people in my team, but we need industry experts to make sure that it is actually fit for purpose. And I would spend time and effort focusing on that rather than forcing a migration.
Other reflections? Anyone in the panel? Different view?
Maybe, and it isn't in the question, so it's unfair to throw it back, but a lot of discussions we've been having internally and also with industry partners is, okay, how do you roll it out and at what level? And I think it's relatively easy to roll it out from the market infrastructure level, where we're already partly there on the security settlement side. Define ISO 22, by the way. And then you can go to the CSDs, ECSDA announced a planned migration date. And then you can go to CSD participants. But then when you end up with the end client, coming back to the very start of the conversation, a lot of the panel discussions here, if the incentive is to encourage investment into Europe, we should be very careful about forcing upon our end clients a certain way of doing business. Because that will cost them in terms of system changes. And they may or may not think that is a valid use of their money, and they might just take their money elsewhere. So at a certain level, you can maybe mandate such a change, and I think we still need to get to an agreement within the AMISECO and elsewhere on what that right level is and how and when. What we as industry participants are quite careful about is that you can't enforce it on the clients. Sadly enough, some of our clients are still talking 775. Okay, so that might go away over time with new technology, but there's no way to force end investors, and we should be respectful of that.
In the interest of time, let's roll the last poll, which is more focused than on this big question. Given the many challenges we're facing, all the activities, T+1, whatnot, DORA, security, what should we prioritize? What is number 1 and 2 here? What should we be spending time on? Hallelujah.
Something else?
The cocktails after this. We'll let it clock up a few more. But it seems we are beginning to see a pattern. And it seems we're still quite busy with one question. What would you say? Any comments on the priorities, Jean-Paul?
Yeah, I think I see somehow a contradiction with the previous answers, because if we made the sum of the two first one, I think we had 70% in favor of migrating sometime and in ISO 20 or 22. So taken in isolation, I think people say, yes, it could make sense that we all harmonize process and the same message. So that could be a target view. But when you put that in a bigger picture, taking into account other big elephant in the room, like T+1 and other initiative like this one, I think there people probably have more interest in other domains like T+1, for instance, compared to just, let's say, a more technical consideration like ISO 20 or 22. So I think it's important to put that in perspective with other initiatives and constraints that we have in our radar for the moment.
Yeah. Kathy?
Well, it's just, in some ways I'd be amazed if the response was anything other than T+1. But, you know, what does that mean, T+1? It encompasses so many aspects that we've already heard about today, and many of the points that I made earlier about where are the pain points, where are the challenges when we look at you know, cross CSD or cross-border transactions. I believe that if we tackle these, they will really help to make a noticeable change in the success rate on T+1, because we see already today that where are the pain points then in settlement efficiency? A lot is around ETF. ETF is a classic cross-border business. There are complexities around that, but tackling many of these other issues, it's a step-by-step you know, multifaceted approach that we need to take to support, as FMIs, the industry in making that transition to T+1. And I would just make one other point, which is, you know, sometimes we talk about cross-border. What do we mean by cross-border? I think, obviously, I look significantly at T2S. It's really important that we don't try and turn T2S into a fortress. To make Europe attractive for investors, we have to make sure that the functionalities, and there are really good functionalities in T2S, are also available then to investors who are coming in from other CSDs. Because otherwise we're creating this type of fortress or a barrier to entry, and that scares off liquidity. So again, these are the types of issues that I would say, as we chip away at those, either at the technical or at the process or at the standards level, this will all help with the transition to T+1. The good thing is we've now got a timeline, so let's get our sleeves rolled up and let's get at it.
Get at it, yeah. Juliet?
I mean, I think given the announcement yesterday, not surprising, T+1 is top of mind today. Yeah. But I don't think it necessarily means that we shouldn't be looking at ISO 20022 and aligning processes, because if T+1 means that we need to be more efficient and operations needs to be faster, then there's an obvious role for standards to play there somewhere and for market practice alignment. So maybe I'm not suggesting that it will become the panacea for fixing all of the cross-border market practice problems we have today, but maybe it will be a trigger for some focus on it.
And to add to that, T+1, obviously, that's where the focus of everybody is, and we'll have to do it, okay? We have no choice. So but that gives us still a little bit room and space to do other stuff as well. Everybody's got limited budgets. I don't think T+1 should be an excuse not to work on other stuff, which are maybe less glamorous and less sexy. And we could hear this morning as well that it's hard to tackle local regulatory and market practice barriers. I actually do think that we should focus on those, because these are the small things which actually make investment into Europe more complex, make the cost of running market infrastructures and custody systems more expensive. And some good work is ongoing within, I think, the Eurosystem and the MSECO sub-task forces. We should not lose sight of it, and most importantly, we should actually try to find a solution. It's very easy to say we're going to harmonize. If you harmonize my way, Jean-Paul, I'll be a happy one and you'll need to invest. Okay, so I think we need to find common ground into what is the best way to essentially provide post-trade services, focus on it, track it, and deliver. And that is not sexy at all, okay? And it takes a lot of time. I've been together with a lot of people here in this room on many a lengthy, the working group on that one, but it's worth the effort.
And Andre, last word to you. Where are you on these priorities?
Yeah, our perspectives are very different, right? So is T+1 going to grow our market? Is ISO 20022 going to grow our market? Right, so, you know, we're 100% of the market, right? Now, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because if the market doesn't grow, therefore the investment opportunities and foreign investment into the country, then what are you going to do? So from our perspective, you know, certainly we are focusing significantly on activities that can actually help grow, you know, our markets, right? Because we think there's a level of efficiency that you can gain through this, right? But you have to be an attractive investment destination. What does that mean, right? So, so our perspective is slightly different. Having said that, you know, we've got great partners that gives us access to European markets, right? So we go through one partner to get that access, and that gives us, yet again, a level of efficiency because we've got one process to deal with, and essentially our partners deal with the complexity of the European market. So our perspective is slightly different on this, but yeah, I mean, it's, you know, yeah, good luck. You know, the good news is we've got until 2028 to go to T+1. Okay. Because we're fast followers. Right. So I think South African market will probably follow to T+1, 28, 29, right? So if the whole world goes there, then we will have to follow. But certainly I'm not going to be driving that agenda soon, right? So.
Great final words from this panel. I think focusing on what drives growth and competitiveness indeed is key. And stepping into this panel, I thought of the rain outside as well. Think of Mark's comment, and I remember this quote saying, "God created rain so we all could go home and do our homework and housework." So thank you all for listening and engaging, and thank you for the panel.